"You've become too much for us to handle, Dad." That's what my son, Matthew, said as he looked me straight in the eye. Not with rage, not even with sorrow, just the sterile detachment of someone trying to return a library book that no longer holds meaning. It was January, bitter and gray in Albany, New York. Snow had been falling for days, thick and unapologetic. I sat at the edge of the sofa, a wool blanket on my lap, still warm from the tea my daughter-in-law had placed in front of me without a word. But that tea would be the last thing she ever handed me. "Too much," he repeated. "You forget things. You need help in the bathroom sometimes. It's not fair to Ashley. It's not fair to the kids. We didn't sign up for this." I didn't say a word. I couldn't. I was too focused on the sound of the radiator ticking behind me. A few feet away, my own son stood, his arms crossed like a landlord evicting a stranger. Ashley sat on the other couch with her arms folded too, not looking at me. That told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't his decision alone. This was coordinated, practiced, probably discussed in their bedroom for weeks, if not months. I had built a life around this boy. When his mother passed, I didn't let the grief swallow me whole. I didn't drink. I didn't disappear. I stayed and did the one thing I promised her I would always do: take care of our son. Every little league game, every midnight fever, every scraped knee, every first crush, every single tuition payment. And now he was telling me I was a burden. When I didn't answer, he continued like he was reading from a pamphlet. "We found a good place. Glenstone Assisted Living. It's close, 10 minutes away. They've got nurses, hot meals, a physical therapist. They'll help you get back on your feet." I was still on my feet, damn it. My bones creaked, yes. My hands trembled, sometimes. My memory had its gaps. But I was not helpless. I just needed a bit of patience. A bit of understanding. Maybe a little more time. "What about the house?" I asked, quietly. The house we'd lived in together. The house I'd signed over years ago in a misguided show of trust, to avoid taxes and make things easier, as Matthew had said then. "It's in our name," he said plainly, as if I didn't know. "We'll take care of it. Take care of it, the same way one might take care of trash on pickup day." That night, they packed my things. One suitcase, a coat, my old wristwatch that hadn't worked in years. No photo albums, no keepsakes. Ashley had already reorganized the house, which I realized meant she'd boxed up anything that smelled of me and placed it out of sight. The next morning, Matthew drove me to Glenstone in silence. It looked nice from the outside, modern, tidy, with a large American flag gently rippling in the snow-specked wind. A nurse greeted us with a too bright smile. Matthew shook her hand with relief. And just like that, he was gone. I stood in that small room for a long time after they left. It was clean, sterile. Someone had set a vase with fake tulips on the windowsill. The bed was too soft. The silence, too loud. That night, lying under a stiff sheet with no smell of home, I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because somewhere between the nurse checking my blood pressure and the soft dinner roll on a plastic tray, something in me went cold. Not angry, not even bitter, just cold, like a man who had stepped outside without a coat and suddenly realized winter had always been coming for him. In the following weeks, I learned how the place worked. Medication at 7 a.m. card games in the lounge at 3. Physical therapy on Wednesdays. A hair trim once a month. Everyone here had the same hollow look behind the eyes. Some still had visitors. Some didn't. I wasn't sure which group was luckier. Matthew visited once, 2 weeks after dropping me off. He brought an old coat I hadn't worn in years and told me he'd gotten a promotion. I nodded, said I was proud. But he never asked if I needed anything. He never looked around the room. Ashley never came. She'd gotten what she wanted. And one night, just before lights out, as I brushed my teeth and stared at a mirror that barely recognized me, I realized something. This wasn't abandonment. This was erasure. They didn't just want me out of the house. They wanted me out of the story. A burden. That word echoed in my mind like the toll of a funeral bell. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the wall where the nurse had pinned my lifeboard, a pitiful collage of photos they'd printed from Facebook. Not one of them chosen by me, not one of them showing what mattered. That's when I pulled out the small black notebook I'd kept tucked in the drawer. The one with account numbers, contacts, old property records. I had kept it, just in case. It was time to stop surviving and start remembering who I had been before they told me I was a burden. You'd be surprised what a man remembers when the world forgets him. Back at Glenstone, the days blurred into each other like watercolor left out in the rain. I was always early for breakfast, always polite with the aides. I joined bingo even though I hated bingo, not because I was trying to fit in, but because I was biding time. Listening, thinking, gathering the strength that aging tends to drain from a man drop by drop. But I hadn't always been this frail figure shuffling down linoleum hallways. There was a time I poured concrete with my bare hands, built fences around land I'd bought with my own savings, not my father's inheritance. I laid the wood floors in our old house on 3rd Street with Matthew helping me. 6 years old and proud just to be holding the hammer. The same house he now called his. My name wasn't on the deed anymore. I'd given it to him 7 years ago after Ashley convinced me it was smarter for tax purposes, that they'd always take care of me. That you're not getting any younger, Dad. I was getting older, sure, but not stupid. I kept copies, records, even screenshots of the emails where they promised I could stay there for the rest of my life. Not legally binding, maybe, but morally, that's another story. I wrote everything down in a little black notebook. My last act of defiance in a world where no one cared what an old man had to say anymore. But something else started to brew inside me at Glenstone. A slow, cautious fire. It started the day Nurse Denise, one of the few people there with any real heart, asked me during lunch if I wanted to call anyone. I smiled and said, no, thank you. But later that night, I used the landline near the front desk. I called a name I hadn't dialed in years. Franklin. Franklin was my oldest friend. We served together in the Army in '71. He stayed in Brooklyn, started a plumbing business, had a couple of rough divorces, but always kept his integrity. We drifted, as life does to people. But I knew if I called and said only one sentence, he'd understand. Frank, I need you to drive up to Albany. He didn't even ask why, just asked what day. That was the first brick laid in what would become my quiet revenge. You see, I never blamed Matthew for growing up in a house where things were always taken care of. He never saw the nights I stayed up rebalancing the checkbook or the overtime I put in every weekend. But that's the thing about giving someone everything, they forget what earning feels like. The second brick came the day I met with the Glenstone facility administrator. I told her I wanted to review my billing and see if I had any back payments due. She looked confused. Your son said you didn't have any assets. I smiled politely. He says a lot of things. I requested a full accounting. Then I wrote a check from my own trust account, one he didn't even know existed. Years ago, when I sold a piece of my land in Catskill, I never told him. I tucked it away, just in case. It was time to use it. Over the next 2 weeks, I made moves. Quiet ones. I hired a lawyer from Troy, a smart young woman named Rachel who specialized in elder rights and real estate fraud. She came to Glenstone dressed in navy slacks and a scarf, carrying more compassion in her eyes than my own son had shown me in a year. We talked for hours. I showed her the emails, the deed transfer, the notarized agreement where they'd promised lifetime living rights. She read every word. This isn't just cruel, she said softly. It's legally questionable. You may have more options than you think. Good, I replied, because I'm tired of being the old fool in the corner. Meanwhile, Matthew was busy living his perfect suburban life, sending out holiday cards with smiling faces that no longer included mine. I knew because I checked their Facebook page from the communal computer. They posted pictures of family dinners, pumpkin carving, school plays. Never once mentioned me, never once visited since that first time. But the thing about being ignored is, it gives you room to move. Frank arrived one Sunday afternoon. He walked into Glenstone in a leather jacket smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and said, "Well damn, Wallace. You look like hell." We laughed. Then I handed him an envelope with keys, instructions, and copies of the legal letters Rachel had prepared. He was my eyes and hands now. He would visit the house, let them know I wasn't dead, that I was watching, that I was coming. "You sure about this?" Frank asked before leaving. I nodded. "They buried me too early, Frank. I'm just digging out." Later that week, I mailed Matthew a letter. No threats, no accusations, just this: "Son, I hope the comfort of your life has not made you forget who built the foundation beneath your feet. I may be old, I may be slow, but I am not invisible." Dad. I knew he wouldn't write back, but I wasn't doing this for closure. I was doing this for clarity, for justice, for every older man sitting in a room full of strangers, wondering how life so full of sacrifice could end in betrayal. And I had one last card to play, because the truth was, Matthew had built his life on my back. And now it was time to show him what it felt like when that back no longer carried his weight. The thing about houses, they remember. Even when people forget who built them, who paid for the pipes and hammered in the first nail, the foundation remembers. It holds those secrets tight beneath layers of drywall and paint. But eventually, when the weight of lies gets too heavy, the cracks start to show. Rachel, my lawyer, was the one who saw the first fissure. She'd done her homework. She pulled title records, financial statements, and county tax files. What she found was a quiet web of deception. Matthew had refinanced my house 3 times under his name, took out equity loans against it. That might not have been illegal, given that the deed had been transferred to him, but it was built on a promise, and more importantly, on paper-thin ethics. One line in particular stood out: owner-occupied primary residence. Rachel looked at me. "You were still living there when he applied for this. That's misrepresentation." I swallowed hard. He said the paperwork didn't matter, that it was just for the bank. "It matters," she said, "especially if it was fraud." That was the moment I stopped doubting myself. I'd spent months asking whether I'd overreacted, whether maybe I'd been too hard on him, whether maybe I really was a burden. But fraud has a way of clarifying things. Rachel filed a formal notice with the county, initiating a quiet title action. It's a process that questions the legal ownership of the property, especially when there's evidence that coercion or misrepresentation played a part. It wasn't a lawsuit yet. Not exactly. It was the kind of paper that made people sweat. I didn't tell Matthew. Not yet. Instead, I asked Franklin to deliver one more thing to the house. A small wooden box. Nothing dramatic. Inside it were copies of old photographs, him as a boy on my shoulders in the backyard, him helping me paint the mailbox, a birthday card he made for me in 3rd grade that said to the best daddy, "I'll never let you be alone." And beneath all of that, one line written in my handwriting: "You built your future on my past. Let's see what happens when the past starts speaking." I heard from Rachel 3 days later. Matthew had called her office, furious, threatening to sue me for harassment. Said I was a senile old man stirring up trouble. She didn't flinch. "He's panicking," she told me, "which means we're exactly where we need to be." Meanwhile, I stayed in Glenstone, calm as a winter pond. Played chess with the quiet guy in room 212. Watered the plants in the activity room. Waited, but inside me, something shifted. A quiet satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. Because for the first time since they dropped me off here like an unwanted suitcase, I was no longer powerless. Franklin kept tabs on the house. He said Ashley wasn't speaking much. She'd started locking the side gate. One neighbor asked why the old man hadn't been around. She said I'd moved for my own good. They always say that, for your own good, but stripping someone of dignity is never for their good. It's for convenience, for image, for silence. One evening, as the sun poured gold across the linoleum floor of my room, I sat back in my chair and thought about all the years I'd traded for their comfort. The early retirement I didn't take so I could help with their down payment. The time I cashed out a bond to pay for their IVF treatments. The times I said yes when my bones and my bank account begged me to say no. It wasn't the money that hurt. It was that none of it meant anything in the end. Not to them, but it meant something to me. And now, that history was finally speaking louder than their entitlement. Rachel scheduled a court hearing. Matthew would have to appear. He would have to explain, under oath, why the man who built the house, who had lived there for over a decade, suddenly became an unwelcome guest with no rights. He would have to answer why he took money from refinancing the property while assuring me I'd always have a home. Rachel looked at me across her desk and said, "Are you ready for this?" I nodded slowly. I've been ready since the day they closed the door in my face. Because what they never understood was this: I wasn't trying to ruin their life. I was just done letting them ruin mine. And justice, even at 74, even from a nursing home bed, still feels like standing upright for the first time in years. Courtrooms don't look like justice. They look like waiting rooms with fancier clocks. That morning, I sat in a gray jacket and slacks Franklin lent me, knees stiff from a night of little sleep. I had the same feeling I did years ago when I walked into a hospital delivery room and saw my son for the first time, only this time. I wasn't welcoming him into the world. I was preparing to show him who I really was. Matthew sat 2 rows ahead, beside a young lawyer in a navy suit who looked like he still got carded buying beer. Ashley wasn't there. Rachel whispered, "They think this will be quick. A few objections. Brush it off. But they don't know what I have." She was right. She opened with photos of me in front of the house, dated and time-stamped. Then emails, copies of texts where Matthew promised, in writing, that I'd always have a place there. Even a voicemail where he said, "Don't worry, Dad, your name not being on the deed means nothing. It's your home too." His lawyer fumbled, stammered something about informal family arrangements not being legally binding. But Rachel had anticipated that. She pulled out a binder and read excerpts from New York State precedent cases. Elder financial abuse, constructive trust, promissory estoppel, each legal term struck like a gavel. Matthew looked at me, no longer smug, just pale. Then came the financial records. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Wallace, you refinanced this property multiple times. Was your father living with you during these transactions?" Matthew cleared his throat. "Why, yes. And did he contribute financially?" "He gave us some support, yes. But you did not disclose his residency or contributions on your applications." Silence. The judge set down his pen. "Then it appears we have more to examine here than a simple family disagreement." Rachel leaned over and whispered, "We'll win this, even if it takes months." But today was about planting doubt in the court's mind. And I saw it. I nodded. As I stood to leave, Matthew brushed past me. Not a word, not a glance, but the quiet in his steps told me everything. The man who once looked through me like I was furniture had just seen the floor tilt under his feet. The truth, long buried beneath convenience and pride, was crawling into daylight. I didn't need revenge. I just needed a judge to see what a son tried so hard to erase. And for the first time in years, I felt seen. There are things a man carries in silence, and then there are things that carry him. For a long while, I let grief carry me. But now, I carried something else, clarity. My decision had been made, and while I wasn't fueled by anger, there was a kind of cold resolve running through me that I hadn't felt in years. The papers had been signed. The necessary documents filed with the help of a lawyer who, surprisingly, did house calls. Mr. Glenn Reichman, soft-spoken, discreet, and brutally efficient, came to the nursing home under the guise of a distant cousin checking in. We met in the common room over a game of dominoes. No one thought anything of it. He handed me a clipboard, I signed, and with that, the final stage began. I had drawn up a new will, one that removed my son from every inheritance line. Everything was now left to a scholarship fund for underprivileged kids in the Bronx. Kids who reminded me of the boys I used to mentor before I got too old to do the work myself. Glenn assured me that the fund would bear my name and would operate indefinitely. I also made sure to formally reclaim my life insurance policy, my savings, and the pension account that Charles had quietly transferred into his name by leveraging the power of attorney I never fully understood when I signed. We filed a revocation and built a legal wall thick enough to make sure that man couldn't touch a dime of mine ever again. Then came the apartment, small, quiet, nothing grand, on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Astoria. But it had a window that faced the sunset and a landlord who was kind enough to install a chairlift for me. The place had warmth, a heartbeat. I moved in quietly on a Thursday morning while Charles was away at a corporate retreat in Connecticut. The nursing home had been informed. The movers came, handled my meager belongings, and left behind only a faint smell of mothballs and camphor. When Charles returned, there was a letter waiting for him. I had written it by hand. I imagined his face as he read it. "Charles, you always said I was a burden. So I finally took your words to heart and gave you one in return. A legal one. You'll find your name absent from any future dealings involving my estate. What's more, you'll now be required to pay back the sum you took from my pension, as ruled by court filing number 1187BX, attached herein. You see, son, I may have been old, but I was never blind. Good luck explaining to your wife why the card no longer works." Dad, it was brief. No anger, no elaboration, just weight, like a stone dropped into still water. In the weeks that followed, I received no calls, no visits, but I did hear from Mr. Reichman that Charles was trying to challenge the revocation. He wouldn't get far. The video recording of me reading and confirming each clause in the new documents had seen to that. Instead, I turned inward. The apartment became my sanctuary. I started volunteering again, at the community library, reading to children. I met people who looked at me not as an old man to be managed, but as a storyteller, a mentor, someone who had survived something. And I had survived betrayal. I had survived the slow erosion of dignity. I had survived being called a burden. But now, in the quiet of my own space, I was free. There's a strange kind of silence that comes after a long war, not the silence of defeat, nor the silence of victory, but something in between. A stillness. That's what I live in now. Each morning, I brew a small pot of coffee, no longer worried if someone else likes the brand. I sit by the window of my modest Astoria apartment, and I watch the sun climb between buildings like it's trying to remember what hope feels like. Sometimes I hum, sometimes I write, sometimes I simply stare at the mug in my hands and let it remind me that I am no longer anyone's burden. You might wonder if I ever heard from Charles again. No, not a single call, not even after the court ordered him to repay part of the pension fund he'd siphoned. I imagine the pride in him is too thick, the shame too raw, or maybe, just maybe, he believed every word he said. That I was a burden. But let me tell you something, being old is not a crime. Needing help is not failure. What's failing is the heart that forgets the hands that once lifted it from the ground. My son forgot. He forgot the nights I worked double shifts when he was a boy with shoes full of holes. He forgot the Sunday mornings I skipped breakfast so he could have seconds. He forgot the basement I turned into his study nook, the time I gave him my last $100 for an engagement ring. He forgot me, and in my place, he saw weight. But the older I get, the more I realize, forgiveness is not always a door we must open. Sometimes, the greatest act of dignity is simply locking the door and walking away. I see men like me sometimes, at the diner, in the park, waiting for the bus with eyes that stare too long at nothing. And I wonder how many of them carry bruises that don't show. How many were pushed aside, labeled as old and useless by the very people they once sheltered from storms. To you, I say, you are not useless. You are not invisible, and you do not have to wait for permission to reclaim your life. I did not choose this late awakening, but I answered it. With a pen, with legal papers, with silence sharper than any scream. I didn't throw plates. I didn't beg to be seen. I simply took back my name. And if you, dear friend, find yourself in a home that no longer feels like yours, at a table where your voice trembles because you've been made to feel small, remember this. You built more than walls. You built people, and even if they forget that, you don't have to. My name is George Abrams. I'm 74 years old. My son put me in a nursing home and called me a burden. So I gave him a real burden in return, one written in ink and stamped by the courts. And now, I live alone. But I've never felt more free.